YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, just getting ready for the Sunday roundtable discussion on the 16th of April.
Media, it really has opened the door for anyone with access to Facebook and Twitter, hasn't it? They can all be part of the debate. It's changed the game, it's reduced the influence of traditional media as opinion leaders and really given everyone the ability to speak straight to power, hasn't it? Sources of news, both genuine and fake, have proliferated. More extreme views have joined the political debate, and the tone of discussion is often heated. Now, there's a view, often expressed with despair, that civility has gone out the window, along with the desire of politicians to cooperate to achieve political and social outcomes in the broad public interest. Well, today at the Sunday Roundtable, we're asking the question, is our public debate around politics, culture, religion, is it more polarised than ever? Well, our three guests have all got skin in this game. Peter McEvoy is the executive producer of the Q&A program on ABC television. Janet Albrechtsen is a commentator and columnist with the Australian newspaper. And Laura Damasi is a research director for the Mind and Mood report produced by Ipsos Australia. And Laura also writes a column on digital social trends for Fairfax Media. Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Hi.
Peter, has the public debate become more polarised?
I think that perhaps overall it has. I wouldn't jump to a final conclusion. In the 9 years that Q&A has been on air, there have been shifts and changes in the public mood, and people have been positive about politics and negative about politics, and people have been bitter and angry, and people have been optimistic and forward-looking. So things do vary over time, but at the moment we seem to be going through a patch where public discussion has been more heated, and we've seen that certainly in some of the examples on Q&A.
But I mean, history's littered with polarising times. I mean, you think 100 years ago, the debate over conscription, the debate over the Cold War, I mean, these issues split the Labor Party. Laura, your thoughts? Are we living in more polarising times than usual?
Well, I think the biggest difference, and you mentioned this in your introduction, is that now the people, in inverted commas, can talk back in a way that they've never ever been able to do. So I think one of the things I'd say about that is that, sometimes in the digital world, it can feel like the whole world is screaming, and actually it's not the whole world. It is always a small minority, and they just have the loudest voices and the greatest command over the stage. And it's usually a certain kind of person. I know in research that we've done, if you look at the sort of psychographic profile of these highly active social media users, there's a thing called scope analysis that you can do. These people are highly critical, they're highly sensitive, they're very superior. There's a certain kind of person that really flourishes in the digital world. And it feels like civility in general is just in demise, but actually it's just a small group of people. They just have so much more influence.
Janet, your thoughts about that? And is it confined primarily to Australia, or is this happening all across the Western world?
Tom, I think we're seeing right across the Western world a much more polarised environment. And I take Laura's point that technology is certainly playing into that. But I think what is happening is technological, it's cultural, it's political, it's economic. And you've got this, what I think is a fairly toxic mix at the moment that places the two sides of politics, and it is two sides, it's left and right. It's as if the two sides are bunkered down, and they won't give an inch for fear of losing ground. And that means that you don't make any concessions. It means that you don't call out people on your own side when they may step over that line of civility. I think the line of civility gets blurred because we don't call it out often enough when we should. And I'm not, trying to be a Pollyanna here. I just think there is a way to have a debate. And when you look at what's happening in America, I've spent, a month this year in America. I've never felt it as polarised in New York, for example, or Washington. And I'm sure it's the same in other cities. You see it in Australia and politically in Europe. There's never been a more polarised time, whether it's the rise of the left, or the extreme right.
Missing the grey, in other words.
There's no grey and there's very little nuance. And Tom, I can see it in my own experience. Once upon a time, I was seen firmly on the right, and I was able to criticise the right without much blowback. But these days, if I make a criticism of the right, I get called a loony lefty. Now I find that quite extraordinary. It doesn't
Yeah.
like politically I'm in limbo, but I know I'm not
No.
because my convictions haven't changed, but something else has changed.
What about Q&A? I mean, Peter, you've been running the show there for the best part of a decade. It is the heart and soul of the ABC's opinion programming of a huge audience, started in 2008. What are the changes you've observed over that time with the nature of the debate on Q&A?
Oh, look, there have been quite a few changes. And as I said, changes in the political mood have been very marked. The program started at a time of national optimism about the Rudd years, but then it's gone through all these periods of, despair and bitterness and anger and
What, 4 or 5 prime ministers?
disappointment. every prime minister's been a reason for optimism or despair, and that's all changed over time. But I think that social media does mean there are a lot more voices out there. There are a lot more voices. There's not more listening though,
Yes.
and I think that's what Janet's pointing to in a sense. So people aren't actually paying attention to the substance and the points that are being put forward. They just decide. Some commentators decide which side you're on, which team you're part of, and make their decision on that basis rather than on the substance of the argument.
But Laura, all too often labels foster simplistic divisions and they create artificial alliances, and yet increasingly we are bogged down in these tribal warfare between these ideological wings.
I think a lot of what's driving this is that general kind of disregard and distaste for and indifference for politics in general. I think that the moderate voices are gone because moderate, normal people have given up. They don't care. There's a sense that, the political class and it doesn't resonate with me. They don't, and I've seen this in my work as a researcher. I've been doing this particular kind of research for 5 years, and I've been watching and waiting, because when I first started, there was a lot of positivity around Malcolm Turnbull years before he came to
Well, he
the
was the
throne.
darling of the Q&A, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he, people all around Australia were talking about him. I'm talking, it didn't matter to whom their allegiance was originally. And I thought, okay, all of this disenchantment with politics, it's just going to take a popular leader. And then lo and behold, look at where we are. So that tells me that the relationship that Australians and much of the developed world has with politics now is terminal. I believe we're in a phase of a sense of, everybody talks about disruption. Disruption's reinvented every single element of life and business. Politics was the last thing left, and this is disruption for politics. Political leaders no longer represent what they used to represent. This is much bigger than any individual.
Back to Q&A, Janet. Has it been a force for good in this debate, or has it contributed to this polarisation?
Look, we're having a lovely, respectful conversation. I don't want to ruin it.
This is your chance to be kind, Janet.
This is my chance to be kind, Peter, and I'll be very kind. I think, in a sense, Q&A is a symbol of what we're seeing at the moment, where people are looking for affirmation. I've had look, it's no secret. Peter and I have had long-running disputes about what I think could be better with Q&A, and I've appeared on Q&A. I've watched it over many years, and I don't think that it really tries to have a debate. I think that there are certain subjects, and you can measure it by the applause from the audience, that invariably get all the cheers. I know that I felt going on there that I was mocked, because I once believed that marriage should be the union between a man and a woman, and not just mocked by the audience, Peter, mocked by the host. And let me give you an example, a recent example. When we talk about trying to, draw some lines on what is civil and calling it out when it's not. I recall a couple of weeks ago on Q&A when you had the host, Tom Ballard, I think, was hosting the program. And it was the Monday, yes, it was the Monday after that Bill Leak, the cartoonist in The Australian, had he died the previous week. There'd been a memorial on Friday. And the question was asked whether the hatred on social media towards him was acceptable. And while the panel was discussing it, an audience member stood up and said, Bill Leak is a racist. Now, I think that should have been called out, but instead the host of Q&A said, well, we appreciate your passion. We understand that you want to make a stand here. I say call it out, just as I've called out Mark Latham in recent times, where I think he really has stepped over the line. He is absolutely brilliant in his insights, but I don't think it helps debate when you step over the line into the realm of saying You know, maybe I'm a little bit prudish. What is indecent? I think calling Bill Leak a racist was indecent. I think it would have been better for the host of a program like Q&A to say, no, we don't accept that
Peter?
here.
Look, Janet, I take your point on that, but actually, I have a different perspective on that event in particular. Someone at the back of the crowd calls out something and misbehaves in the audience. Now, as you know, every time the program happens, we ask people to be civil and to listen, and we remind them that we're not going to accept behaviour where people call things out. I think that, in fact, most people watching at home weren't able to make out clearly what was being yelled at. And I think that the way that Tom handled it makes sense, because if every time someone calls something out, we correct them, we also reiterate what they're saying and we amplify what they're saying. In that circumstance, I think it's best to say, look, we appreciate you're yelling out, you're passionate, but this is not the place for it. And the words that Tom used were actually, you'll have to leave. And those people were quickly escorted in the back of the theatre, and that meant that they couldn't go on interrupting the program. And we went back to the panel and back to the discussion and back to the civil discussion, and that's what Q&A should do. I think that what Q&A is trying to do, and what I don't think that a lot of the other media are doing, is to bring together people who have different points of view. I think that, based on what Laura's saying, maybe our political system isn't capable of satisfying people anymore. But the media has to take some responsibility for that. And more, the model of success for the media is niche media focused on particular segments of the population. So you read the Saturday paper or you read the Australian. You don't read both. And that's why it's important that on Q&A, there are people on the panel who have different points of view. You know that in the audience, there's a range of different points of view. And we bring people with differing points of view together to have a civil discussion and try and progress things a bit. I agree that it's not always 100% success, but I think that concept has some value.
If you just could I just come in, Tom, just for a second, and just make one quick response. Peter, I remember being on Q&A one day, and I don't want this to be all about Q&A, but it's indicative of, I think, the role of the ABC, which I think can be critical, and certainly it has a charter to present a diverse range of views. I remember being on the panel of Q&A once, and we were getting all these really interesting questions. There wasn't a single question on the usual same-sex marriage or border protection or climate change. Mm-hmm. And I whispered to someone, these are really interesting questions. And I was told that the audience, a lot of the audience had been bussed in from outside of Sydney. Now, that tells you that there are views outside of inner Sydney, the inner suburbia that we know, mm-hmm. that are very different. And I think the ABC is there to reflect those views. And you get different questions. You, in fact, get a much broader debate on issues. You don't talk about the same things over and over again.
Let me just clarify there. We have audience bussed in every week. Every week there are people coming in from different parts of Sydney or whatever. I agree we need to have as broad an audience as possible. And as broad a panel as possible.
If you've just tuned in, you're on RN Sunday Extra. This is Tom Switzer, and I'm with Peter McEvoy from Q&A, Janet Albrechtsen from The Australian, and Laura Damasi from the Mind and Mood Report. Laura, is social media driving, or is it just reflecting a polarised debate?
I think it's driving it, because I think that, again, it comes back to what I was saying before, that part of the mechanism of polarisation is really loud voices fighting against each other. And in no other time in history have the voices of everyday people been able to be heard so loudly. We're in an environment where the mainstream media, the icons of the old media world, the Fairfaxes of the world, report on what's said on Twitter. But I wanted to make a point about, you were speaking about media and, how it's really important we get exposed to a broad range of media. And that is becoming really, really hard in the age of social media, and particularly with younger people. I have seen the impact of what hyper-customized personal social media is. And let me give you an example of that. So I was in Melbourne just after Malcolm Turnbull was, made Prime Minister, and I asked a group of girls in their 20s, I said, what do you think of the new Prime Minister? And no one said anything, and they looked at each other and they said, oh, is that onion guy? No, he's gone, someone said. And then someone else jumps in and goes, I think it's that Short, what's his name? Short someone. Anyway, it took them about 30, 40 seconds to work it out. And these girls, I'd spent an hour and a half with them. There was nothing dim about them. Half of them were uni graduates. They were great. They were nice girls, intelligent. What this was a sign of intensely customized media. You screen out anything that you're not interested in. So you create a bubble. So
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that is a real problem because, you know, people get stuck in that bubble.
And there we go on the upload limit. Back immediately.